Introduction. Welcome to the audio tour for Pucker Gallery's 2012 exhibition of fine choices and sculptures by Chana Orloff. The content for this audio tour was selected from text written by Pucker Gallery directors, associates, and interns. Thank you and enjoy. Stop 1. Chana Orloff. Nude sitting in an armchair. Figurative sculptor Chana Orloff is best known for her many bronze portraits. Her work was done in the realist tradition, yet shows traces of the Cubist movement. In Nude Sitting in an Armchair, this Cubist influence is highlighted by an ambiguous form, which is defined by minimal geometric body parts. The nude's feet are disproportionately small compared to her overall figure, which leads the viewer's eye to the most prominent part of her body, the midsection. The bulge in her lower abdomen suggests that she might be with child, thereby emphasizing the figure's femininity. Orloff was born in the Ukraine in 1888, but at age 16 moved with her family to Jaffa, Israel, where she worked as a seamstress. 6 years later, in 1910, she moved to Paris, where she studied sculpture and moved in the circles of avant-garde artists. In 1913, 3 of her sculptures were accepted by the Salon d'Automne, and later she had an entire room devoted to her works in the Petit Palais of Paris. She also visited the United States, where she held exhibitions in New York and Boston. Orloff continued to live in Paris until 1942, when, fearing arrest as a Jew during the Nazi occupation, she fled to Switzerland. Her Paris studio was vandalized, and much of her work was stolen or destroyed. After the war, she returned to Paris and set about to revitalize her career there with a series of drawings and sculptures depicting her wartime experience. For the remaining years of her life, Orloff continued to work productively and exhibit on a regular basis, holding many large-scale exhibitions, including a retrospective at the Tel Aviv Museum in 1949, which exhibited 37 of her works. Stop 2. Mallory Lake, Aliano, Tuscany. Mallory Lake, deeply influenced by numerous trips to Italy, has produced a superb series of works dedicated to the memories of her experiences abroad. A small selection is presented here. Through her skilled manipulation of pastels, Lake has expertly conveyed the peaceful beauty of the seemingly boundless Tuscan countryside. She achieves a misty, atmospheric look by carefully smearing the chalky material over the paper's heavily textured surface. In doing so, the colors blend subtly from one shade to the next, producing an effect known as sfumato. She has eliminated all superfluous detail that may have caused the viewer's eye to stray from the overall tranquility of the scene. In a manner similar to the work of the Impressionists, Lake provides the viewer with a single image that can be subtly altered by minute changes in light. Her deft handling of the pastel allows the viewer to see how the passage of light affects the overall appearance of her subject. As a result, Aliano Tuscany becomes subjective for each viewer that takes the time to study it from more than one vantage point. By simply adjusting one's position, the viewer has the capacity to create his or her own image, one that possesses fresh and subtle variations in both light and color. Stop 3. Phil Rogers. Jugs PR 1051, PR 642, and PR 687. Welsh potter Phil Rogers lives on a rural farm where he has converted a stone cowhouse into a studio and built kilns in the old stables. His stoneware ceramics are a wonderful combination of British, Korean, and Japanese techniques and traditions. Rogers has done extensive traveling and lecturing on pottery, kiln building, ash and salt glazing, and has numerous books to his credit. His work is well represented in more than 50 international public collections. For British people, the jug is synonymous with a vessel with a single side handle and a pouring lip. Mr. Rogers wrote in 2006, quote, "If a potter is going to concentrate on a certain form, then it is only right and respectful to learn something of the traditions and conventions that have contributed to the growth and development of that form throughout the centuries." The jug is a peculiarly European form and was not used in Asian ceramics until the mid-19th century. In essence, it has remained unchanged since at least the 12th century. Indeed, by the 13th century, jugs of such sophistication were being produced that it is remarkable they were not developing for a considerable time already. The jug form probably extends as far back as the Norman Conquest, although they were hand-built rather than thrown on a wheel at that time. These particular jugs allow the artist to showcase the extraordinary and unique results of his various glazing and firing techniques. Stop 4. David Aronson, cellist. The seemingly still melting bronze in David Aronson's sculpture of the cellist lends the musician, who is absorbed in the moment with his eyes closed, an air of true dynamism and motion. Although the piece is large, solid, and heavy, and the musician is deeply focused, there is also a distinct lightness to the figure. He wears a slight smile on his face, and the instrument is clearly familiar, an extension of his body. And yet, the lightness appears to come from within, from a transcendent ecstasy rather than mere joy. Indeed, the metal on top of the musician's head makes him look like some sort of priest or clergyman, buoyed rather than encumbered by the gravity of his position and responsibilities. Furthermore, the play of light on the metal contributes to the inherent energy of the piece. The bronze is a deep, rich chocolate brown, craggy in some places but smooth and reflective in others. David Aronson was born in 1928 in Shilova, Lithuania, and has lived and worked in the Boston area for nearly 60 years. He was educated at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and has taught at Boston University since 1955, where he formed the Fine Art Department. Along with his rich history in Boston, he has also exhibited in Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Los Angeles, Tokyo, Paris, Rome, Berlin, and Copenhagen. Aronson's work is represented in over 40 public collections. Stop 5. Tatsuzo Shimaoka, large platter, teapot, and square bottle. Unlike many Japanese folk potters who inherit familial ceramic styles and techniques, Tatsuzo Shimaoka's visual identity was his own to discover. After completing his apprenticeship under Shoji Hamada, Shimaoka was free to develop his own distinct style as a studio potter. However, Shimaoka too felt a pull towards his roots and his own family's tradition. His father was a cord maker, and Shimaoka made it his signature technique to use rope-impressed inlay as decoration on his pots. This method, called Joman Zogan, can be seen on the large platter, number 58, and the square bottle, LA6. While the clay was still wet, Shimaoka pressed cords of rope into the surface of the clay, then painted into the depressed area with colored slip. Using different weaves, Shimaoka created a variety of patterns on his surfaces. It was his mastery of this technique that earned him the distinction of National Living Treasure in 1996. Hakame brushwork, as seen on the teapot CC29, is another technique frequently used by Shimaoka. Oftentimes, Shimaoka calligraphically painted plant or animal-like shapes onto a form after first applying a light layer of white slip. Stop 6. Alley Clift, Twilight. Many of Allie's scenes come from memories of places where she has lived and traveled. Her earlier works were inspired by a circus she attended when she was young and living in Cuba. These were followed by a series of Mexican still-life cloth paintings based on Oaxaca, where she often visited with her late husband. More recently, she has used cloth to create striking images of waterfalls and lush rocky landscapes inspired by the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. Twilight embodies many elements of Allie's work: the mixture of motion and silence, the visibility of cloth, and subtle and varying textures and tones. The drifting pieces of cloth coming from the upper left-hand corner are reminiscent of scraps of paper floating in the wind and give the piece a sense of motion. In fact, these pieces of cloth extend past the edges of the painting, as if they are being swept beyond the frame. On the other hand, the single flower blooming straight up from the base of the image provides an anchor that keeps the whole composition from floating away. Allie breaks up the dark mood of his composition with the bright petals of the flower, as well as the thin, subtle highlighting on the stem of the flower and along the horizon. In both of these places, Allie has used a thin orange thread to create a bright line of separation, whose visibility changes with the light. In fact, many of Allie's works seem to change before your eyes when viewed from close up or far away, and also under varying degrees of light. which adds to the complexity and intrigue of her mysterious scenes. Stop 7. Maria Muller, Pink Poplar. While hand-painted photography is not a novel medium, Maria Muller's painted photographs encourage the viewer to observe the world in an unusual way. Born in Karlsruhe, Germany, Maria eventually found her way to Medford, Massachusetts, after spending much of her adulthood traveling around North America. Photography became a way for her to document unfamiliar places and record her thoughts. Her subject matter has included scenes from her travels to Africa, Miami Beach, Spain, and the Arnold Arboretum in Boston. Beginning with black and white infrared film, Maria develops dreamlike images in the darkroom. After selecting photographs she finds worthy of painting, she applies thin layers of rich and energetic oil pigments to the photograph with cotton swabs and tissue paper. Much to the viewer's enjoyment, Maria's color choices and their slightly peculiar placement add an element of complexity and attentiveness. In Pink Poplar, Maria chooses a lavender pink hue in place of the poplar's natural green foliage to instill an element of surrealism into an otherwise realistic scene. The viewer cannot help but revel in the satisfaction of viewing the world from someone else's curious and creative perspective. Stop 8. Igichiak Peter, Drum Dancer. Inuit artists are often referred to by multiple names. Igichiak Peter, or most commonly Iyitsiak Peter, was a Canadian Inuit artist from the settlement of Iqaluit, which sits just 3 degrees of longitude below the Arctic Circle on southern Baffin Island. Born in 1937, Iyitsiak began making sculpture and prints as a young man in the 1950s and 60s. Drum Dancer beautifully captures Iyitsiak's mastery of cutaway composition, a characteristic that takes full advantage of the versatile serpentite or soapstone of the southern Baffin Island region. During Iyitsiak's lifetime, Inuit sculpture underwent a fundamental shift from tourist commodity to art form. His dancing figure sounds the drum of a traditional past, while looking forward towards and embodying the dynamic lines of modern Inuit art. Stop 9. Samuel Bach, The Eternity of the Right Angle. Sliced pawn corpses, bullet-ridden bulbs, and silhouettes of recently hollowed-out soldiers linger, strewn across a still intact corner of a tormented battlefield in an unsuspecting landscape of earth, which first felt the tremors of catastrophe in 1933. That same year, similar disturbances surfaced in the so-called Jerusalem of Lithuania, Vilna, where Samuel Bach was born into a childhood of fervent creativity and violent history. It was then that games became short-lived in pre-war Poland and were rapidly and cruelly replaced only with the realization of the belligerence that the game of chess so well emulates. Upon the execution of 4 adoring grandparents and a beloved father, alongside thousands of other anonymous fellow Jews, in the woods of Ponar, no monument was made to commemorate their struggle, no battle hymn pronounced to acknowledge the sacrificed, the disposable, the numerous, the pawns. And so the artist returns to the embittered landscape, which has been paralyzed in time by the very earth which housed its violations. Neglecting to repair the blasts of the battles, to remove the shrapnel or recover the lost souls, Bach preserves the scene, leaving it free of the contamination of time past and memory numbed. Instead, in this piece, Bach constructs monuments for 2 men, and while not distinguishable, the wrinkles of ancient wisdom and timeless pain allude to an unparalleled intimacy with the memorialized victims. The 2 figures are reminiscent of 2 extremes of war, the immediate victim and the eternally tormented survivor. Or perhaps it is a fierce confrontation between man and the extremities of his own nature, set at the limits of a natural landscape, the edge of the ocean, a conflict not intended for the eyes of a child. And yet, as a child, Sam Bach matured through ghetto art exhibitions and an education provided by discarded books in a hidden convent space. Now, he still responds fiercely to his memories. He has been an artist from birth, through the Vilna Ghetto, the Landsberg Displaced Persons Camp, the Bezalel Academy of Art, and the École de Beaux-Arts, with exhibition spaces all over the world, from Lithuania itself to Houston, Texas. He is still painting, in a peacefully chaotic studio in Weston, Massachusetts. and issues a cry of protest at a childhood chess game stolen from his youth and materialized into a deadly, unintended reality. Thus, it is eventually the child survivor, too, who lives to erect monuments to the honorable, rises above the perpetrator's fallen prey to the bloodthirst of the game, in order to warn of the eternity of the battlefield's footprint on an unforgiving earth.